ear is etched not in years, but in the memory of pervasive dread. Imagine a world wrapped in the soft patina of routine, the smell of wood smoke and baking bread, the measured rhythm of oxen pulling carts across dusty lanes. This was life before the whispers began. A deeply ordered existence, dictated by seasons, faith, and the unshakable belief that divine order governed every rising sun. The fields were worked according to ancient rhythms. The guilds maintained their rigid structures, and the people moved through life with a practiced resignation, a deep comfort woven from shared tradition and predictable suffering. It was, in its own way, idyllic, relentlessly functional. The illusion of safety is perhaps humanity's most powerful drug. We establish our equilibrium not through absolute protection, but through comforting predictability. The routines of the manor house, the bells ringing across the town square, the quiet prayers offered before meals, these were the anchors that kept the collective sanity from drifting into chaos. To believe in these rituals was to believe in permanence. But even perfect stability is merely a temporary pause between catastrophic events. And sometimes nature itself offers a sinister preview. It begins with anomalies, moments so subtly wrong they are initially dismissed as coincidence. A sudden sickness among the domesticated animals, livestock succumbing to a baffling fever that no herbal poultice could touch. The natural cycle appears disturbed. Perhaps it is the smell of something unfamiliar carried on the wind, a stench too metallic, too sweet, hinting at rot beneath the veneer of civilization. The first indications are almost imperceptible, like smoke curling up from a hearth far away. A fever that burns with an unnatural intensity, coughs deep enough to shake the chest and steal breath. At first, these ailments are simply local afflictions, the whims of poor sewage disposal or seasonal change. The community shrugs it off. It is just bad luck, they say. Bad harvests led to poorly fed bodies, making them susceptible. The natural explanations, however inadequate, provide a necessary fiction. The quiet acceptance begins its gentle erosion. Families manage the early losses with dutiful silence. A small funeral pyre at the edge of the village, whispered condolences meant to soothe the spirit rather than confront the reality. But then, these localized episodes begin to gather momentum, growing in alarming clusters. One family falls ill, then another block down, and suddenly it is not merely a local affliction. It is an invisible tide pulling people away from their lives. The body, that most private of vessels, becomes a sudden public barometer of fear. The symptoms are bafflingly aggressive. Swellings that appear with alarming speed, darkening patches of skin that seem to bleed through the surface. Doctors, who once held themselves out as authoritative men of knowledge, are confronted by an enemy they cannot categorize in any medical text. Their poultices and bleeding procedures, rituals meant to restore balance, are rendered useless against this novel assault. The established wisdom falters, revealing the deep vulnerability underlying human belief systems. The initial response is characterized by denial. Dismissal, painted with a thin veneer of piety or resignation. People convince themselves that it must be God's will, an inexplicable act of fate to be endured through faith alone. This theological framing offers temporary psychological comfort, placing the suffering within the grand narrative of human tribulation, a lesson in humility, perhaps, but nature does not adhere to comfortable narratives. The fever climbs higher than any dogma can account for. The speed of death defies the gradual decay expected from illness. It is a swift, merciless withdrawal of life that leaves behind only questions and an escalating pattern of incomprehension. The whispers that once hinted at bad smells or animal sickness now become palpable screams, echoing through every empty alleyway and across every trembling threshold. Society starts to notice the patterns of abandonment. Neighbors who usually shared wine on a summer evening begin quietly sealing their doors. Merchants, whose lives depend entirely on proximity and trust, start hoarding supplies, salt, grain, medicinal herbs. And suddenly, cooperation is less valued than survival. The veneer of ordered life cracks under the sudden weight of exponential death. The predictable rhythm of the market square falters. The communal prayers sound hollow when confronted by bodies piled high outside the city gates. This is the moment the invisible threat transcends mere disease. It becomes an existential challenge to everything humanity holds dear. Its physical health, its social contracts, and ultimately, its concept of itself within the divine order. We have crossed the point where illness can be contained or cured. We are now faced with a creeping uncertainty that promises nothing but potential collapse. The whisper has become a roar, echoing the ultimate fragility of civilization. The initial tremors of the pestilence taught us that life is fragile. They taught us how quickly the fragility can turn into a frantic, desperately commoditized market. As the sickness overwhelmed medical understanding and defied divine explanation, something far more primal kicked in: panic. This panic wasn't merely fear. It was an economic engine running on desperation. Suddenly, survival became a transaction. What worked today, a handful of burnt roots, 3 breaths drawn near aromatic wood, a poorly mixed poultice derived from the local ditch, became priceless currency. The market for cure opened up instantly. And unlike modern pharmacies regulated by germ theory, this was an unregulated chaos driven by sheer panic buying. We see entire shelves emptied not of necessities like grain or water, but of uselessly expensive remedies. People started stockpiling cures as if the plague were merely a seasonal allergy. The black market flourished in the wake of failed institutions. Doctors, once pillars of academic authority, found their established wisdom dissolved into guesswork and desperate charlatanry. Priests, whose words traditionally provided ultimate comfort, often found themselves ill-equipped to confront biological terror. Even basic hygiene, a principle that seems self-evident today, became suspect or impossibly difficult to implement when the threat was unseen, relentless, and seemingly omnipotent. Trust fractured along predictable lines. The local herbalist, who once dispensed remedies alongside gossip and comfort, now suddenly held life-saving knowledge in his fingertips. His advice, even if dubious, carried immense weight because all other sources of authority had failed spectacularly. This created an immediate power vacuum that was swiftly filled by the perceived miracle cure, the rumored tonic, the specific ritualistic cleansing, the potent mixture drawn from exotic origins. Suddenly, ignorance wasn't a lack of knowledge. It was merely an unpurchased commodity. The pursuit of a remedy became obsessive and profoundly individualized. Neighbors competed not just for remaining resources, but for the best chance at prophylactic obscurity. We see the frantic hoarding of clean cloth, not just for body wraps or bedding, but as perceived defenses against miasmas, the invisible taint that supposedly spread the death. Every corner store, every quiet alleyway became a pseudo-pharmacy stocked with remedies whose efficacy was entirely proportional to the size of the coin purse carrying them. This commodification of fear is key. The panic didn't just create demand, it allowed for the manufacturing and marketing of hope itself. Anyone who possessed an outlandish theory, a belief that arsenic mixed with stale bread could ward off the bubo, or that merely wearing certain colored wool would repel divine wrath, could package it, sell it, and capitalize on the desperate whimpering, buying power of the afflicted. The narrative shifted from seeking actual medicine to acquiring certainty. And in the throes of mass hysteria, certainty is always for sale. It was a terrifying spectacle. A marketplace where the value of an object was determined not by its utility, but by the depth of despair it promised to alleviate. People paid fortunes, sometimes selling their livestock, sometimes forfeiting property rights for promises whispered in smoky taverns or shouted from hastily constructed stalls. These remedies were rarely cures. They were momentary distractions, small pocket bribes handed out by the desperation itself. The breakdown of trust was total. The community structure that held life together, the shared belief in established knowledge, the mutual obligation to look after the sick and the weak, simply dissolved under the unrelenting pressure of immediate self-preservation. We witnessed neighbors turning on each other, not with malice necessarily, but with a cold, utilitarian logic. If you stand between me and my own survival, then your continued existence becomes an inconvenient liability. The failure of the established order didn't result in quiet resignation. It resulted in frantic, commercially motivated scrambling. This desperate scramble taught humanity something essential about its own nature. When confronted with a problem that defies logic, science, and even traditional piety, our first instinct is not to retreat into introspection or acceptance. Our immediate, deeply wired reflex is to externalize the problem, to make it measurable, purchasable, and conquerable by exploiting flaws in the system, the flawed cure, the corrupt vendor, the conveniently targeted scapegoat who happens to wear the wrong colored clothes. The desperation of the sick gave way to the capitalist impulse. How do I monetize my survival right now? And this economic logic paved a very direct, tragic path toward finger-pointing bingo and the brutal art of assigning blame, given the initial shock of invisible death, where conventional remedies and divine pleading had failed. Humanity's desperate attention inevitably turned inward. The existential void created by the plague was a vacuum, and every human mind desperately seeks to fill those vacuums with narrative, preferably one that points fingers. This is where history delivers us our masterclass in basic psychology. Scapegoating. It is perhaps the single most dependable and reliable mechanism of social control known to humankind. To understand it fully, you do not need to be an expert in medieval epidemiology. You only need to be a connoisseur of panic. The logic is terrifyingly simple. When facing a problem that defies all understanding, a death so aggressive, so indiscriminate, the human mind resists chaos by imposing order. It demands a villain, a localized cause, someone who can be finger-pointed and whose suffering gives the illusion of cosmic justice. Suddenly, otherness became a commodity more valuable than breathable air or clean water. The marginalized, the already suspicious, the visible outsiders, they were not merely targets. They were necessary structural elements in the temporary architecture of collective sanity. Whether they were itinerant merchants, foreign travelers passing through the gates, or groups who simply lived outside the accepted moral parameters of the village, their existence provided an easy pivot point for blame. The narrative built itself on difference. If you could successfully categorize someone as fundamentally separate from us, then their suffering, or the accusation leveled against them, could be ritually used to cleanse the community. It was a social transaction of terrifying efficiency. Fear converted directly into lethal certainty. The accused became prophylactic sacrifices, diverting the collective terror away from the incomprehensible workings of the heavens and onto a human failing. Consider the records left behind by plague-ravaged towns. They are less about medical data and more about accusations. Accounts detailing mass persecutions, the sudden inability of neighbors to defend themselves, and the swift descent into rumor-fueled vigilantism paint a consistent picture. The plagues didn't just kill people, they detonated pre-existing social fissures and gave everyone permission to turn their suspicion lethal. And who bore the brunt? Historically, it was those already at the bottom of the ladder, the paupers, the undocumented, the religious outsiders whose practices diverged even slightly from the mainstream. These were people whose lives offered minimal threat but maximum symbolic flexibility as scapegoats. The implication was never that they caused the plague. Rather, it was that their mere presence suggested a moral laxity, an invisible pollutant tainting the social body. The mechanism of panic is exquisite in its self-perpetuation. Once suspicion lands, the evidence is often irrelevant. Rumor travels faster than any official mandate. A whisper suggesting that certain items, perhaps unusual foods or foreign practices, were responsible for the sickness, would bloom into an unshakable certainty by dawn. The desperate need for a coherent explanation overpowered all rational thought. What makes this history so darkly useful and, frankly, so disturbing is its immediate continuity with our own time. The pattern of assigning blame remains structurally identical. When complexity overwhelms us, we prefer simplicity, and the easiest variable to adjust is often the most vulnerable member of the group. The plague offered a highly potent template for mass psychology, one that suggests nothing about medieval society was unique in its susceptibility. This early use of accusation established a lethal pattern. It taught later generations and certainly provided manual fodder for our contemporary understanding that when true knowledge is inaccessible, suspicion becomes the most profitable form of truth. The scapegoat mechanism ensures that even when external forces are overwhelming and insurmountable, the community can at least feel momentarily safe by sacrificing an internal suspect. It gives a perverse sense of agency to absolute helplessness. In short, the Black Death did not invent prejudice, but it acted as a brutal and highly effective cultural catalyst. It took pre-existing biases, the suspicion of the stranger, the discomfort with difference, and armed them with fatal conviction. The plague proved that when survival is at stake, our capacity for cruelty scales up almost proportionally to our level of incomprehension. If pointing fingers proved a useful skill in finding an immediate culprit among the masses, then spiritual self-flagellation provided a profoundly profitable form of public theater. By chapter 3, we had learned that human panic was surprisingly adept at manufacturing and trading suspicion. But the most deeply ingrained reflex, perhaps the one that required no intellectual effort and zero material resources, was simply to appeal directly to the divine. This belief system formed what we shall call the Divine Complaint Department, a spiritual hotline manned by terrified, overzealous individuals who believed God was merely running late on humanity's emotional receipt. We are talking about an enormous theological misunderstanding of cosmic bureaucracy. In our modern understanding, divinity is either indifferent or incomprehensibly omnipotent. In the 14th century, it seemed to operate like a disgruntled civil servant with a bad attitude and a particularly theatrical sense of humor. Death wasn't just random, it felt managed, scheduled, and worst of all, subject to a complaint review process. The immediate, highly visible consequence of this flawed theology was the explosion of radical penitence. Forget mere acts of charity or simple prayers for safe passage. These people escalated their grief into spectacular public rituals, designed not just to appease God, but more accurately, to appear sufficiently pathetic and self-punishing before their neighbors. The most notorious was flagellation. Imagine enormous crowds gathering in town squares, hundreds of people, many men who once held positions of minor civic authority or religious devotion, whipping themselves with leather straps until they were bleeding and barely conscious. This was not private remorse. This was performance art fueled by sheer terror. The underlying logic was dangerously simple. If the plague is divine punishment for collective sin, then we must demonstrate our sufficient suffering to prove that we are worth saving. We are essentially telling the cosmic administrator, look at us. We are experiencing intense pain. Please reconsider canceling life. It was a highly performative accounting of damnation. These displays of extreme piety were brilliant examples of groupthink operating under maximum stress. The immediate relief derived from physical self-harm and communal suffering was powerful enough to override any logical reservation regarding the actual efficacy of beating oneself until passing out. Furthermore, the act itself served a crucial social function. It immediately provided a new common activity, thereby refocusing collective anxiety away from the mysterious killer in the streets and onto the rhythmic, predictable pain administered by one's own hands. If Chapter 3 taught us that suspicion was a commodity best sold to marginal groups, then flagellants demonstrated that suffering itself was a highly volatile and profitable currency. By bleeding publicly, they were simultaneously attempting spiritual redemption and maintaining social relevance in a dying world. The message being broadcast wasn't just we sinned. It was we are currently paying for our sins using fresh blood. The emotional impact of this desperation reverberated far beyond the town squares into the structure of belief itself. When the established institutions, the physicians who failed, and often the moderate clergy, who could offer little more than stale platitudes, could not provide comfort or cure, people sought the most dramatic forms of reassurance available. This led to a fragmentation of religious thought. Some embraced extreme severity, others retreated into hedonistic denial, treating the imminent collapse of society as permission for an immediate and extravagant living. The veneer of organized pious conduct simply dissolved into two stark opposites: theatrical self-mutilation or absolute sensory indulgence. It is critical here to see this pattern not just as religious fanaticism, but as a purely sociological mechanism of coping with unreality. When the external world presents an incomprehensible threat, a biological agent that ignores social contracts, wealth, and physical strength, the mind struggles for any form of predictable ritual. Self-flagellation provided that predictability. Pain was reliable. God's wrath, while unpredictable in its timing, offered a mechanism, atonement, through which it could theoretically be managed. It gave the terror a narrative structure, turning existential dread into a quantifiable spiritual debt. This process reveals a key insight applicable across history, and indeed to our own era of information overload. When foundational systems fail, whether they are biological defenses, medical infrastructures, or reliable sources of truth, the collective mind defaults to simple, dramatic narratives of moral failure and divine retribution. It is profoundly satisfying, in a deeply disturbing way, to believe that a measurable sin, an identifiable wrong action, can account for a truly random global catastrophe. Comparing this spectacle to our modern context requires careful framing, because the scale of the spectacle has changed, but the psychological root remains perfectly constant. The flagellant processions were public displays aimed at the visible heavens. Today's pseudo-divine complaint department operates via algorithmic feeds and private group chats, aimed at invisible consensus. The raw physical pain of self-whipping has been replaced by the searing intellectual ache of perpetually engaging in hostile digital debate, a modern form of collective, performative suffering. The underlying impulse remains identical. When reality is too big, too scary, or too random to process, humanity prefers to believe it's simply a solvable moral problem. We need a narrative where failure can be traced back to a mistake, a secret sin, or an incorrect article of faith. It is far less terrifying than accepting that sometimes things are just profoundly random, and for which there is no divine explanation at all. Thus, the medieval attempt to negotiate with a furious God gives us invaluable insight into the human algorithm of crisis management. We crave not knowledge, but narrative coherence. And when deprived of both, we will always find the nearest suitable target, whether that target is an outsider in the street or a flaw in our own collective spiritual ledger. The plague arrived not with a mighty roar or an army of flesh-eating monsters, but with the quiet intimacy of an inhaled breath. It was a terror that invaded the personal space, turning every cough into a prophecy and every shared cup of water into potential poison. And so, in the face of something so fundamentally uncontrollable, a microscopic enemy invisible to the naked eye, the human mind, masters of pattern recognition, demanded order. If death was unavoidable, then surely control was possible through sheer performance. The attempts at control that followed were often not acts of science, but elaborate public theater. They were gestures, dramatic and desperate affirmations that something could be done, even when the body itself was failing. Consider the burgeoning black market for remedies. Here, hope became a tangible commodity, priced by desperation and marketed with dubious conviction. Remedies ranged from burnt incense to allegedly protective animal parts, sold alongside vials of questionable herbal concoctions. The notion that one's personal atmosphere could be purified, a preventative shield bought in barrels or small glass bottles, was particularly potent. The plague transformed breathable air itself into a commodity. You paid dearly for the guarantee of something clean, safe, and critically, enough. But these attempts at control were fundamentally symbolic. They were psychological placeholders designed to manage dread. When men with legitimate medical knowledge failed, when prayers offered no solace, humanity defaulted to the theatrical. If it looks like science or ritual or authority, we will accept it. The most famous of these symbols were undoubtedly the plague masks. These grotesque, beaked apparatuses, spearheaded by filled pouches meant to hold fragrant herbs, became iconic images of late medieval desperation. They represented an attempt at literal purification, breathing in manufactured safety, projecting an image of knowledgeable caution. The wearer walked through a city whose air was supposedly toxic, armed with a mask that merely contained expensive potpourri and the visual weight of fear itself. The quarantine protocols were another monumental effort in perceived control. By sealing doors, enforcing separation, and restricting movement, authority attempted to draw neat lines around chaos. They tried to box death out of sight, believing that isolation was synonymous with safety. These measures functioned not primarily as epidemiological tools, but as social mechanisms for triage, defining who belonged within the safe zone, and implicitly, who had already crossed the threshold into unspeakable danger. The result was a complex blend of pseudoscience and performance art. People developed elaborate personal rituals, burning specific woods, carrying certain charms, adhering to strict schedules of prayer or cleansing. These actions provided ritualistic coherence in a world that had lost all logical consistency. They gave the participants the illusion of agency, the feeling that their adherence, their purchase, their careful breath could cheat fate. But this deep-seated yearning for an external mechanism of control paved the way for profound misinformation. If medicine failed and quarantine merely delayed the inevitable, people needed to know not just what was wrong, but who or what was responsible enough to be blamed. This necessity propelled the search for a scapegoat. The plague taught medieval society that expertise could fail, that divine favor could withdraw, and that physical distance offered only temporary respite. When these pillars of presumed stability crumbled, the human impulse reverted to its most ancient, efficient function: locate an other and assign all blame to them. The black market for breath was merely a localized symptom. The manufactured enemy waiting in the shadows was the underlying disease of social anxiety. It set the stage perfectly for the finger pointing that would follow. The failure to control the air, the body, or the spread of contagion meant that people were forced to focus their terrible attention on something they could categorize: a group of people, an ideology, a marginalized community. And thus, the search for breathable safety became inextricably linked with the deadly business of accusation. The contagion was not merely a biological event, it was an unmaking. It peeled back the veneer of civilization that had so diligently masked its profound fragility. As death became the immediate, undeniable neighbor, institutional structures did not flex, they shattered. The central authority, which medieval man had always expected to be omnipotent, whether embodied in the royal decree, the bishop's mandate, or the physician's dubious cure, found itself abruptly irrelevant. When plague struck, it didn't respect feudal loyalties, divine right, or complex bureaucracies. It simply followed the path of least resistance: the living. The initial attempts at governance were frantic and ultimately performative. Commanders issued orders to maintain order. Priests preached adherence to ancient rites. Merchants organized armed patrols. But these commands, delivered from a relative position of safety, rapidly dissolved upon encountering the raw horror of the infected street corner or the abandoned granary. What was left was not merely chaos. It was an accelerated regression into primal self-preservation. The sophisticated tapestry of medieval life, unraveled thread by painful thread, replaced by the stark, brutal calculus of immediate need. The most damning evidence of this collapse lay in abandonment. It wasn't just that people died, it was who lived at the expense of others. Fathers left behind wives and children if their continued presence represented a risk rather than a resource. The sick were entombed not by formal process, but often by neighbors whose fear outweighed their piety. Entire households, once bound by blood or vow, simply excised the weakest link to protect the whole. These acts, while horrifyingly efficient from a purely survivalist viewpoint, stripped away any pretense of communal morality. The collective contract, built over centuries through shared tradition and religious dogma, was reduced instantly to a transactional ledger sheet. And this is where history becomes darkly instructive. When the system fails to provide answers, when medicine offers nothing but poultices and prayers, and religion offers only terrifying inevitability, human beings default to localism. The macro narrative of God's will or papal authority collapses into the micro narrative of me versus you. Trust becomes localized, hyperspecific, and fiercely conditional. Survival now depends on the neighbor you can physically see, the relative who lives nearest your meager hoard of preserved goods, and the guard whose vigilance is guaranteed only by a quick exchange of necessary coin or valuable favor. The resulting environment was pure local anarchy, not of grand revolutionary scope, but of devastating, intimate failure. Communities ceased to function as cohesive units defined by mutual responsibility. They became clusters of isolated, suspicious individuals huddled together for warmth and defense. The concept of the common good evaporated beneath a layer of desperate selfishness. If my roof is sound, I care nothing if your family's life ends on the street corner, as long as their despair does not compromise my ability to sleep soundly tonight. The breakdown of central authority was terrifying in its quiet efficiency. It taught humanity a devastating lesson that our deepest social structures are built not upon law or tradition, but upon persistent, shared belief. And when belief fails, the only thing left standing is brute self-interest. We saw neighbors turning on neighbors, driven not by malice per se, but by an overwhelming, panicked instinct to minimize their own eventual suffering. The veneer of sophisticated society was peeled back to reveal something far older and much uglier: a terrified animal scrambling for solid ground. This localized desperation became the perfect incubator for misinformation, providing fertile soil where seeds of pure paranoia could take root and grow into lethal belief systems. When formal channels of truth, the established medical guild, the respected academic scholar, the overarching religious hierarchy, are overwhelmed by death, people crave immediate, digestible explanations. And what is more readily available than finger-pointing? The local rumors, whispered around sputtering fire pits, are far easier to digest than a complex understanding of contagion vectors or medieval epidemiology. They offer certainty in exchange for basic human dignity. The crisis transformed from an epidemiological puzzle into a sociological brawl. People didn't just try to survive the plague, they tried to restore narrative order to their panicked existence. And that required someone, somewhere else, to take the blame. The grand system had failed them personally, and now they needed a tangible culprit, a community outside their immediate sphere of concern, who could bear the burden of explanation, allowing the local group to maintain a fragile, self-congratulatory sense of moral superiority. This wasn't just hysteria. It was an adaptive mechanism for psychological survival in the absence of any real intellectual framework for coping with the inexplicable mass death. The collapse of the central structures had created a vacuum of staggering proportions. When the great authorities failed and communal rituals ceased to function, what remained was not civilization as we knew it, but a brutal calculus dictated by proximity and immediate survival. The plagues did not merely kill people, they fundamentally altered the operating system of society, stripping away the comforting illusion that stability was guaranteed. In the aftermath of mass death, history rarely remembers the heroes or the prophets. It is far more interested in those who simply kept breathing, those who managed to inherit a little more arable land, or those whose accumulated wealth remained untouched by the sudden fever. The plague served as an involuntary and devastating social sorting machine. It was, for all intents and purposes, a massive, brutal buffet where human worth was measured not by piety or virtue, but purely by genetic luck and economic advantage. The surviving population found themselves in an incredibly disorienting landscape. Property lines blurred, debts evaporated with the suddenness of death, and entire generations of established hierarchy simply vanished overnight. Think of it as a catastrophic reset button pressed across the social ledger. The land remained stubbornly fertile, yet who would claim its bounty? Who had the labor to till it? And more critically, who could afford to guard that labor? The initial assumption was perhaps one of tragic equality, that all men were equally shattered by fate. But this quickly proved to be a naive conceit. The structure of surviving life immediately tilted toward those already holding structural advantages: the landowning gentry, the organized merchant class, and the few resourceful survivors who had been far enough from the main contagion points to secure their physical selves. The plague acted as an unparalleled market correction for wealth, but it was not a benign one. It simply accelerated pre-existing fault lines. The peasant farmer, whose life was largely characterized by sweat and cyclical toil, suddenly found himself in possession of either far more breathing space than expected, or, conversely, utterly redundant labor when the land could no longer be managed. Their bargaining chips, their physical presence, were now strangely inflated. Meanwhile, those who possessed accumulated liquid wealth, gold, salt, spices, and stable titles, saw their fortunes solidify with terrifying speed. They were the ultimate beneficiaries of a massive population purge, inheriting not just property, but also the vacuum of authority. The great houses that had endured for centuries could see their remaining members solidify power through sheer demographic misfortune faced by their rivals. The social fabric did not simply mend itself, it was rewoven by those who could afford the finest threads and the sharpest shears. Suddenly, class distinction became less a matter of custom or law, and more an immediate, palpable reality etched onto the very landscape, a physical marker distinguishing the manor house from the empty peasant cottage. This temporary breakdown did not necessarily lead to radical equality. Rather, it often led to a brutal renegotiation of existing power dynamics. The sheer difficulty of managing life in the wake of such catastrophe bred a sense of transactional necessity. Survival became an economic negotiation where emotional bonds and historical obligations held surprisingly little weight compared to who could enforce contracts or wield necessary violence. We see the emergence of new forms of social capital, the specialized knowledge of apothecaries, the reliable strength of able-bodied laborers, the network connections of merchants willing to move goods through epidemic terror. These commodities quickly superseded religious devotion or inherited nobility as the metrics for immediate value. The result was a period marked by intense fluidity and subsequent hardening. The desperate need for labor after the plague drove up wages and gave unprecedented leverage to the working classes in certain regions, shaking the foundation of feudal obligation. This economic shift provided the nascent seeds for future social unrest, a fertile tension between the established elite clinging desperately to their perceived rights and a sudden surge of bargaining power among the masses. The surviving poor and middling classes were presented with a grim buffet, immense opportunity mixed with profound instability. They could potentially rise through sheer hard work, or they could be instantly devoured by lingering suspicion, economic downturns, or outright banditry that followed in the wake of lawlessness. There was no safety net, only raw, unforgiving human will meeting systemic collapse. This era established a foundational pattern. When great systems fail due to unprecedented trauma, the ensuing social structure is immediately and ruthlessly reorganized around those who hold limited, indispensable resources, be it capital, muscle, or information. The plague was thus not merely a medical event, it was an economic crucible that redefined human value in terms of scarcity. It taught humanity, by horrifying example, how quickly deep social bonds can fray under the pressure of pure self-preservation, setting a deeply cynical tone for all subsequent interactions with power and survival. The coughing fits eventually subsided. The desperate barricades came down. The black market remedies were burned, or perhaps simply spoiled by time and damp air. As the great swell of fever finally ebbed into a ragged trickle of occasional sickness, humanity did not rise in a triumphant roar of catharsis, as history books sometimes suggest. There was no grand curtain call of deliverance, only the weary, profoundly disheartened shuffle back toward routines that felt alien and meaningless. The immediate aftermath of the plague, what we might term the Great Forgetfulness, was less dramatic than the panic preceding it. It was a slow, disorienting crawl through the wreckage. The cities did not suddenly become utopias. They were merely emptied reservoirs of ash and discarded life. The frantic energy that had driven the black markets, the theological fervor that had fueled spontaneous public penance, all dissipated into a thick, stagnant silence. In this quiet aftermath emerged the first great cultural shock, the overwhelming statistical reality of absence. Entire family lines vanished, not in singular dramatic deaths, but in scattered waves over months and years. The demographic scar tissue was profound, leaving behind voids that defied explanation. Were these gaps merely biological, simply a higher death rate? Or did they suggest an unprecedented failure of social architecture, a failure of kinship ties, civic duty, even the basic expectation that one's neighbors would remain to bury them? The spiritual and philosophical reverberations were perhaps the most pervasive and difficult to catalog. The established dogma, which had promised a predictable cosmic order, divine justice, cyclical renewal, guaranteed salvation for the pious, had been brutally exposed as fragile, provisional fiction. God, it seemed, possessed an alarming indifference. When death struck so indiscriminately, striking priests, merchants, peasants, and popes with equal casual malice, the neatly constructed theological narratives lost their mooring. The comfortable certainty that underpinned medieval belief structures began to fray at the edges, replaced by a raw, almost unsettling empirical observation. Simply, people died. The surviving scholars, artists, and thinkers found themselves in a state of profound existential bewilderment. How do you write poetry when beauty seems absurd? How do you build laws when human behavior proved so utterly volatile? The arts became darker, more preoccupied with the ephemeral nature of life and the stark contrast between vibrant existence and sudden nothingness. This shift marks the beginning of certain proto-modern philosophical impulses, a skeptical questioning of inherited truths that would echo across centuries. Institutionally, the plague acted as a massive deconstruction crew. The very men who were supposed to uphold knowledge and law, the guild masters, the university scholars, the local administrators, were disproportionately among the infected, or fled the scene entirely. This created critical gaps in governance, legal record keeping, and specialized trades. Knowledge was not simply lost, it was geographically fragmented and experientially traumatized. Certain skills, from advanced navigational methods to complex agricultural techniques, faced sudden periods of neglect because the people who held that specialized memory were gone. However, necessity is, as always, a brutal engine for adaptation. The vacancies created by death led directly to a radical renegotiation of power and wealth. Labor itself became monumentally valuable, forcing a temporary suspension of old feudal strictures. Peasants suddenly possessed an unprecedented bargaining chip. Their continued existence was more precious than the restrictive bonds of tradition or lordly whim. This sudden infusion of economic leverage into the hands of the lower classes laid groundwork for intense social upheaval decades later, setting in motion the massive shifts that characterized the early modern period. The immediate challenge wasn't just recovery, it was memory. The society struggled to integrate the memory of such unprecedented carnage. Some areas attempted denial, a desperate cultural forgetting meant to smooth over the psychological trauma. Others hyper-focused on commemoration, building grand cathedrals and monuments not merely as religious devotion, but as elaborate, tangible anchors against the swirling chaos of impermanence. These physical markers served a deep psychosocial function. They told survivors, if only to themselves, that this absolute void had been acknowledged, quantified, and therefore contained. The cumulative effect of this great forgetfulness was a species exhaustion, a profound tiredness, not just in the body, but in the collective spirit. Life became viewed with a strange mix of intense gratitude and deep fatalism. The sheer randomness of death redefined destiny itself. If one could be struck down by invisible contagion while performing the most pious daily rituals, then perhaps piety, virtue, or social standing meant nothing at all. This realization that fate was genuinely arbitrary was a revolutionary philosophical blow that began to chip away at the divine mandate which had structured civilization for millennia. It introduced a cold undercurrent of skepticism into the cultural bloodstream, an enduring suspicion that life, beautiful though it might be, could snap back toward oblivion at any moment. The stage, having been emptied and rebuilt with hastily cemented memories, was now set not merely for recovery, but for a fundamentally altered understanding of human frailty against cosmic indifference. This quiet aftermath contained the seeds of every future upheaval, waiting simply for enough time to germinate into something much larger and far less manageable than plague itself. If the collapse of local authority was merely a natural law, an inevitable return to localized self-interest, the echoes we hear today suggested is something far more systemic, something tragically routine. We survived the plague's initial onslaught by dissolving into our immediate networks, confirming that in times of true crisis, human connection reduces to simple transactional contracts, survival for loyalty or abandonment for safety. But history rarely offers a clean ending. Instead, it leaves us with remnants, whispers, fragments of accusation, seeds of doubt planted in the fertile soil of catastrophe. These seeds are what we call misinformation, and if you trace them back through time, past the plague doctor's beak masks, and across centuries of hysterical whispers and public accusations, you find a staggering continuity. The fundamental mechanics of panic remain utterly unchanged. They simply exchanged the physical proximity of a contaminated village square for the invisible reach of the digital thread. The scribble rumors that flew through dusty taverns in 14th century London, the claims about foreigners or specific groups being deliberately poisoned, the stories written down by terrified hands and passed on by breathless whispers. These were nothing more than the beta version of today's conspiracy theory. They functioned identically. They provided simple, concrete targets for amorphous terror. The contagion itself was too big, too random, too divine in its malice to grasp, therefore. The mind fixated on something small enough to point at. In those days, a lie gained power through proximity and solemnity. It required physical presence, witnesses, and public performance. You had to be near the rumor mill, hear it repeated face to face, until its falsehood became indistinguishable from fact. The dissemination was slow, laborious, constrained by geography and the speed of a panicked horse. It was an organic echo chamber, bounded by cobblestones and human voices. Fast forward your imagination, if you will, to the present day. Our physical neighborhood has been replaced by the global information feed. And what have we created is not merely a faster rumor mill. It is a hyper-efficient, highly personalized delirium engine. The speed of modern misinformation is its most terrifying feature. It does not require proximity or even direct observation. It requires only an algorithm, a suggestion that follows our existing fears like a shadow. The logic here is chillingly uniform. When the grand narrative, the established medical science, the overarching theological understanding, the functioning political body fails to provide answers, the void demands filling. And people, fundamentally and biologically programmed for pattern recognition, will always fill that void with patterns of blame. They prefer a straightforward villain over an unknowable randomness. The Black Death taught us, quite literally, how easy it is to externalize guilt. We pointed fingers at those who were already visible other, the outsider, the foreigner, the person whose lifestyle deviated from acceptable norms. It was a profound act of cognitive self-preservation. To survive existential dread, we invented structural difference. This proved that perhaps the most resilient part of our species is not our capacity for love or enlightenment, but our unparalleled efficiency at manufacturing enemies. The shift from medieval paranoia to modern digital panic, however, adds layers of toxic genius. Where a medieval whisper required careful circulation through communities, today's misinformation can jump oceans and generations instantaneously, bypassing any traditional gatekeeper, be they priests, learned physicians, or local authorities. The accusation travels at the speed of light, accompanied by an irresistible emotional charge of outrage, confirming tribal membership and promising immediate, simple vindication. The echo chamber effect is thus revealed as a timeless human addiction. We are addicted to certainty, and since the universe offers us none in moments of ultimate dread, no clear explanation for the plague's randomness, no antidote that cures all ills, no neat moral arc for societal collapse, we build our own simple certainties out of paranoia. We trade the medieval accusations against Jewish communities or suspected witches for modern theories about shadowy global cabals, pharmaceutical monopolies, or deep state puppet masters. The bogeyman has changed from a group defined by their residence or faith, to a concept defined only by its ability to generate collective fear and subsequent outrage. But the mechanism remains breathtakingly consistent. When reality feels too complex or too frightening to bear, we simplify it through guilt. We find the villain, assign them universal malice, and temporarily restore narrative order through shared hatred. The plague was a horrifying masterclass in mass hysteria, demonstrating that our most profound vulnerabilities are not biological, but informational. It showed us that panic is not merely an emotional state. It is a powerful social force capable of rearranging economies, dissolving law, and justifying murder, all in the service of restoring simple cognitive comfort. And now, armed with the infrastructure of global instantaneous communication, humanity continues to play out this ancient script, demonstrating nothing but its enduring talent for turning catastrophic doubt into profitable, venomous certainty. It is a sobering, almost darkly comedic testament to the unchanging, deeply flawed algorithm that runs the human heart. We stand now at the end of a story that refuses to have an ending. We have tracked a plague, a terrifying biological curtain call through the centuries, not merely as a historical event or a medical crisis. It has become something far more portable and far more unsettling. A perfect model of human behavior under extreme pressure. What we see in the blackened streets of 14th century Florence mirrors, with unnerving clarity, the scrolling scroll of today's digital feed. The physical bogeyman, the fever, the bite, the unseen contagion has simply been replaced by something infinitely less corporeal, an algorithm, a headline, or a beautifully curated piece of pure nonsense. It is perhaps easier to digest this continuity if we rename our subject. We are not documenting disease. We are analyzing the indestructible human algorithm itself.